The Life of Dwight Moody. Chapter 34. Capacity for Work. To those who knew Mr. Moody closely, it was not difficult to understand the secret of his capacity for hard work. The magnificent constitution with which he was endowed enabled him to undertake work that demanded continual exertion and special effort. But beyond this, he was able to throw off all burden of mind when he had done his utmost. "It's worry that kills," he would say, and at the most exacting work he would be able to relieve his mind of all anxiety and rest as quietly as a child. He believed that God would carry on his own work, and after doing all in his power, he would cast his burden on the Lord. Thus it happened that he could sleep almost to order. A few minutes before going to address a large audience, he would lie down for a nap, asking someone to waken him in 10 or 15 minutes. Added to this was his genius of generalship, in which he would delegate to others the work they could do, and thus spare himself the trouble of details. Mr. Moody's evangelistic zeal could never be contented with missions in Great Britain and America. Reports of the great opportunities among English-speaking people in other countries were always a great inducement to accept frequent invitations to visit the great centers of Eastern life. It had been a long-cherished plan of his to make a tour of the world, and in the fall of 1888, Mr. Moody left home with the purpose of going to Japan and China, and thus to India. Arriving on the Pacific coast, he found it impossible to obtain release from a tentative acceptance of several invitations to conduct meetings. At this time, therefore, he was unable to take the journey, and during the winter he visited instead the cities of the Pacific coast from Vancouver to San Diego. He continued to receive repeated invitations to visit India and China, and on the fall of 1891 he again contemplated the trip. But again it was abandoned, this time after arriving in London, where he was advised by medical men of the danger of such a climate to a man of his age and susceptibility to heat exhaustion. The fact that he suffered from seasickness made the voyages in tropic climates still more objectable. This was a great disappointment, yet at this time he entered upon a work in Great Britain that for sheer physical endurance must have taxed his strength more than any other mission he ever undertook, with the possible exception of the World's Fair campaign. A few months before leaving home, at the time of the Christian conferences, the Reverend John Smith and Dr. Moxey of Edinburgh came to Northfield. At one session of the conference, Dr. Smith stepped to the front of the platform with a large bundle in his hands, while he proceeded to explain was a memorial to Mr. Moody from 50 towns and cities of Scotland, requesting him to make another evangelistic tour of that country. In presenting the petition to Mr. Moody in behalf of Dr. Moxey and himself, he said that it was the most remarkable memorial ever presented to a Christian worker, at least from Scotland. It was 150 feet long and contained 2,500 signatures on its roll, which was nearly a foot thick, including representatives from all of the Scotland churches and schools of thought. Mr. Smith spoke briefly on the special need of Mr. Moody's work in Scotland, saying that the evangelist had the confidence of the churches as no other man had, and that he would bring to many evangelists a blessing that no other man could. Mr. Moody received the package without a word, put it into the speaker's desk in front of him, and asked the people to engage in silent prayer that we may be directed in regards to this matter. No further references was made to the invitation in public, but a decision was given later, and the tour was undertaken that fall. Arriving in Scotland late in November, he began a series of meetings that continued to the end of March. An itinerary had been arranged by his old friend, Mr. William Robertson of Carrubbers Close Mission, Edinburgh, whom he had given carte blanche to make appointments for 3 months. Writing of these 4 months' work, Mr. Robertson says, "I had a list of towns drawn out that Mr. Moody visited in Scotland on his last trip. There were 100 different places, and meetings were held in all of them. During this winter, he averaged 3 meetings a day, often in crowded and poorly ventilated halls and chapels." Mr. Moody had many invitations to spend Christmas with Scotch friends. He preferred, however, to keep the day free in order to give another day to any special place in which there had been much blessing. The meetings in Wick had been exceptionally fruitful, and as the holiday drew near, Mr. Moody resolved to return once more to this town for an evening meeting. Relating the experience of the day, a rather typical one, is showing his faculty for making the most of time. Mr. Robinson says, "We started to drive across the Ord in to Wick, a distance of 37 miles. The sun rose as we left Hemsdale. After a little we got into a gully, from which we again saw the sun rise. Still further on we reached a spot where it again appeared over the hills. Mr. Moody said it would be a memorable Christmas day for him, for he had seen the sun rise 3 times. As we passed Berrydale, the seat of the Duke of Portland, we found some friends who, hearing that we were to drive that way, had arranged for a short service. In 15 minutes 2 prayers were offered, a psalms sung, and Mr. Moody gave a brief Christmas address. At Lipster, another halt was made, and another crowded meeting addressed in the Free Church. Wick had reached soon after 2, and a Bible reading held at 3 o'clock, and a great Mass meeting at 9. Early the next morning, train was taken for Elgin. Surely this was a full day's work for a holiday. It is impossible to go over the work in detail in each place visited. The Scotch mission closed with the final meetings in Edinburgh. It was a notable fact that at the last afternoon meeting, both the moderators-elect of the coming established in Free Church assemblies, the Professor Chartitus and Professor Blanky, were present, and in the consequence of the crowded platform, had to share between them the President's chair. This fact was taken as a crowning illustration of the brotherly and thoroughly unsectarian spirit which marked the mission in almost every place where the meetings were held throughout the length and breadth of Scotland. Later in the year, the writer had a personal experience of a similar nature in a 6 weeks mission with Mr. Moody in Ireland, conducting a short mission in Southampton, England. Sunday night, Mr. Moody started for Dublin, Ireland on a train leaving about midnight, which carried no sleeping car. Arriving in London before daybreak, he had to drive from Victoria Station to Euston Station to catch the train for Holyhead, where a 4 horns passage across the Irish Channel completely prostrated him with seasickness. Dublin was reached by 6 o'clock in the afternoon, where after a hasty supper Mr. Moody addressed a large meeting. Here the audience had been waiting for some time, and the atmosphere was heavy. At the close of the meeting, numbers of old friends pressed forward for a handshake and words of welcome, and it was near midnight before Mr. Moody was able to retire. He was entertained by Peter Drummond, who lived some distance out of the city, and he had to take leave of his host early, drive into Dublin, and get the 7 o'clock train for Belfast Tuesday morning. It had been arranged that he should conduct a 2 weeks mission in the large convention hall in Belfast a week later. And on his arrival, the committee of ministers and laymen, at whose invitations he had come, met him for conference regarding plans and lunched with him at Reverend Dr. Williamson's. In Londonderry, he had time for only a hurried supper after his arrival before going to a crowded meeting that had been waiting for him for over an hour, and it was late that night before he had any opportunity to rest. The remaining days of the week were equally taxing as he visited 6 other towns during Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, often speaking to crowded halls and twice in the open air. The very hospitality which is so characteristic of the Irish added to the demands upon his strength, as in several places, when he felt the need of rest and relaxation, he was entertained at meals where others were invited specially to meet him. Saturday, however, brought a much-needed rest at the homes of James White of Fenaghy, and on the following day he began his Belfast mission by addressing 10,000 people in the crowded convention hall. The last 3 weeks of his mission in Ireland were devoted to holding meetings in the southern counties, where an equally trying itinerary was arranged. Frequently, the meetings were conducted in draughty halls, or either in marketplaces, and the bigotry and superstition of the uneducated masses in some places threatened more than once to make trouble. Never were conditions more trying for him than during that season, and near the close of the mission he began to show the effects of the strain under which he had been working. In a few meetings that followed in Ireland, a heavy cold that he had taken became more pronounced, and on arriving in London to conduct a 10-day mission in Spurgeon's Tabernacle, his voice almost entirely failed him. At this time he was accompanied by Mr. Stebbins and his son, and yielding to their urgent solicitation, consented to see a physician. It was then that Mr. Moody first learned of his heart difficulty, to which he finally succumbed. Writing on this occasion, Mr. Stebbins said, "The 3rd time that I went abroad to assist Mr. Moody was in the fall of 1892. He had engagements to visit several of the larger cities of England, and afterwards to hold an 8-day mission in Spurgeon's Tabernacle. He had been suffering somewhat, for several days with a throat trouble that gave him considerable anxiety lest it should interfere with his work. So on our arrival in London, with his consent, I sent for Dr. Havishon, a prominent young doctor, afterwards one of Mr. Gladstone's physicians, who made a careful examination of his throat and lungs, and incidentally the action of his heart. Before leaving us, the doctor took me aside and told me that he had discovered an irregularity in the action of the heart, asking me if he should tell Mr. Moody. Certainly, I said, he would wish to know of any trouble of that kind. He informed Mr. Moody of his discovery, and after assuring him that there was no occasion for alarm, but simply a necessity for caution lest he should overexert himself, he expressed the wish that Mr. Moody would allow him to make an appointment for a consultation with Sir Andrew Clark, one of the most celebrated authorities of such diseases, as he did not wish his own judgment to be relied on wholly in the matter. Shortly before leaving London, Mr. Moody saw Sir Andrew Clark driving immediately to the letter office from a farewell breakfast given by Sir George Williams and a large number of other friends. After a thorough examination, the physician confirmed the opinion of his friend regarding Mr. Moody's condition. In reply to Mr. Moody's inquiry regarding what he had done to bring on the difficulty and how he should avoid increased trouble in the future, the celebrated doctor inquired how many times a day Dr. Moody was in the habit of speaking. "Oh, I usually preach 3 times a day." "How many days in the week?" 5 days in the week, and on Sunday 4 or 5 times. "You're a fool, sir, you're a fool," was a brisket response. "You're killing yourself." "Well, doctor," said Mr. Moody, "I take Saturday to rest. But may I ask you how many hours a day you work?" "Oh, I work 16 or 17. "How many days a week?" "Every day, sir, every day." "And, doctor, I think you're a bigger fool than I am, and you're killing yourself first." And with these pleasantries, the 2 men parted, and the celebrated physician to continue his wonderful ministry of healing for little more than a year, while Mr. Moody was permitted to work on for 7 years, although with the consciousness that his summons might come at any moment.